everyone, and welcome to ConTinual, the con that never ends. I'm Jeanne Adams, and I'm your host tonight for a fabulous hour with Lee Modesitt. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
It is a delight to have you with us. Lee is has just turned in his 80th book, has more than 50 short stories, has been published since the 1980s, and is an icon in our industry. So it is a distinct pleasure for me to chat with you tonight about your incredible books, about your career, about everything else. How did you get started in this crazy business? What made you, you've been a naval aviator, you've been worked for the government, you've sold real estate, you've done all sorts of stuff. What made you decide to sit down and write a book in this crazy world?
I never intended to be a novelist. I actually started out writing poetry in high school and wrote poetry for almost 10 years, never got further than the small literary magazines. And after I got out of the Navy, I was in my late 20s, somebody said to me, "You're never going to get very far in poetry. You've read science fiction all your life. Why don't you try and write a science fiction story?" And I thought, well, maybe I could do that.
Well, all of us need to thank that long ago friend.
But so I wrote a story and I sent it off. And the only magazine I really knew, because I read it, was Analog. So I just sent it to Analog. And Ben Bova sent me back a rejection letter, but it wasn't the standard rejection letter. It basically said, "This isn't a bad story except for the financial mess you've been made on page 13. If you fix that, I'll look at it again."
Oh, what we in the business call a good rejection.
Yes. So I fixed it. He bought it. And I thought, yes, I'm a writer. Now, this was in 1972.
Right.
It doesn't come that easy.
Hear that, kids? Doesn't come that easy.
For the next 10 years, I wrote probably close to 100 stories and had all of 6 accepted. Then I got another rejection letter from Ben Bova, which basically said, "Don't send me any more stories. I won't buy them." And after I got over the shock of those 2 lines, I read the next line, which is, "It's pretty clear to me that you're a novelist trying to cram novels into short stories. Go write a novel. Then we'll talk about the short stories." And that was why I wrote The Fires of Paratime, because I figured Ben was the only one buying my stories.
Right.
And if my only market wasn't going to buy them, I didn't have much choice. I was not real enthusiastic about this to begin with, because when you're only selling, at that time I was down to selling maybe 1 in 5 stories. And I'm thinking, back then novels were about 90,000 words. And I'm thinking, do I have to write 500,000 words to sell 1 of them? And of course, at that time I was working full time in a high pressure job in the federal government, running a congressional office. And I thought, I don't know, but I don't have any choice. So I wrote The Fires of Paratime. And unfortunately, I thought I was going to sell it to Ben for him to serialize. But he wasn't the editor of Analog by the time I finished the book. So I had to try and sell it over the transom, as they say in the old language. And I just went through every publisher I could find, and they all rejected it. And then it went to Jim Bain, who was then at Ace, and he kept it for a year. And every month he said, "I'm going to publish this." At the end of a year, he sent it back saying, "I can't publish it. I keep telling myself I could, but it's just not my kind of book. Somebody will buy it." Well, the only editor left on the list was David Hartwell, who was at an outfit called Timescape. And he actually bought it.
Which is great. Now, they were an imprint, Simon and Schuster, and I know they folded shortly thereafter.
Right.
So it was like one bad turn. Bless your heart.
Well, we're not done. They published it. It got pretty good reviews, but when they had folded, that didn't help matters.
Right.
Well, I didn't have an editor. And none of the editors who wouldn't buy me before wanted to buy me now. However, David had an assistant by the name of John Douglas. And John Douglas ended up as an editor as an editor at Avon. And John bought my second book for Avon for half what Timescape paid for the first book.
As you said before, it's never easy.
And after it was sold, Hearst took over Avon and froze all submissions for 3 years. So I didn't have anybody who wanted to buy the next book.
Oh my goodness.
Then I got a call from David Hartwell, and he said, well, I can't offer you very much. I'm with this new startup outfit, but we would like to buy it. And I said, oh, who's the startup outfit? And he said, oh, Tor. Tom Doherty started this company called Tor. Well, I thought, what do I have to lose? Nobody else is going to buy anything.
That's right.
And I've been with Tor since 1985.
Most excellent. So the third one, the one you sold to Tor first, was then The Forever Hero, right?
Right. The second was The Hammer of Darkness.
Mm-hmm.
And the third one, I'm trying to think of what the third one was.
Was it a standalone, or was it one of the first of your series?
No, it was the Colleton.
The Colleton Matter?
Well, it was the first book of the Colleton Matter.
Right, which is that stars Nathaniel Whaler as
right.
An economist and killer. I liked that description, an economist and killer.
Yes. Yeah. And although that's a 2-book series, I didn't write the second book until several years later.
Yeah, I talked to Lee before we started this interview because I was confused about publication dates. So there we go. That's an answer to that. So what was the impetus behind your largest series? Is the Magic of Recluce series. And to date, there are 22 books and a set of short stories in that series.
Right.
What was the impetus behind that one? That one has been one of your largest series. So where did the idea for that come from?
It came from a con.
From a convention?
My very first convention. It was Baldicon. And at that particular time, I was working a 60-hour week. At that point, I was divorced. I had 4 kids. I was the custodial parent. And David Hartwell called me up and said, Lee, you have got to get out and go to conventions. And I said, David, when? He said, there are weekends. And I said, so? You think you're going away? And he said, you really need to go. And I said, I'll look at it. Well, I knew I was in trouble because this was before email and before lots of other things. When I got a list of conventions from David overnight, the next morning, I thought, he's pretty serious about this.
And when your editor says you should go.
Yes. And when he's the only editor who's buying your books, it becomes close to a command.
Yes.
So I look at everything and I noticed that there's this convention called Baldicon. Now I came up from the reading side, not from the convention side. So I'd never been to the convention. I knew what they were, but that was about it.
Right.
And I saw Baldicon was in a few weeks. I lived on the north side of DC. It's only 40 miles away. It was the closest thing around, and it would get David off my back. So I called David up and said, I'll go to Baldicon. He says, fine, here's the name of the program chairman. You need to call him. The what? Program chairman. You will get on the program. Hopefully you talk intelligently. Hopefully this sells books. I said, I got the picture.
Right.
So I called up the program chairman. I think his name was Mike Smith, but I won't swear to it. It's been quite a while ago. And I said, I'm Lee Modesitt. He said, oh, I'm really glad to hear from you. Nobody knows who you are.
What a greeting.
Well, I mean, David had said, all I was a name on a page. Nobody knew who I was. program chairman validates this. Well, I'm a little flustered by this, but we come to an agreement that I can only come for one day. It'll be Saturday because I could get babysitters on Saturday.
Right, right.
So I decide that I'm supposed to show up, get my badge, 10 o'clock on Saturday morning. I do all of that. Well, I should say, I realized after I got off the phone, I never asked what panels he was putting me on. And I was much younger then, much more male, hated to ask anybody for directions. And I certainly hated to call somebody up and say, oh, by the way, I forgot to ask you what panels I was on. So I just showed up. And the first panel I was on was economics and politics in fantasy and science fiction. Okay, I read science fiction. I'm an economist by training. I'm involved in politics. What possibly can go wrong?
Oh, wrong question. Ooh.
Well, I discovered that one of the reasons I'm on this panel is there are 4 fantasy authors on it. And no science fiction author, I think, wanted to be on the panel.
Oh, dear.
And I'm listening and I'm just trying to take in things. And I made a mistake. It's not the mistake I usually make. Usually I talk too much. But this time, I just wanted to get my feet under me. And after about 5 minutes, the moderator turns to me and he says, maybe it was even 10 minutes. Lee, you haven't said a word. What do you think about the way fantasy authors handle politics and economics? Now, I'm borderline Asperger's. That's something I discovered late in life, but it happens to be true. And if you ask me a question when I'm caught off guard, I will tell you exactly what I think. I said, from what I've read so far, none of them know squat about either. Now, things have gotten much better since 1980. I was 85 or 86. They've gotten much better in the field since then. But at that time, I can say, if you look at the fantasy published there and before, they didn't know squat about either.
Well, they certainly didn't do their research.
Right.
Which is much, to their credit, it's much easier for those of us who are writing now to do our research.
Well, but that's true. But back then, the state of economics and politics and fantasy was somewhere between abysmal and dismal. It's much, much better now. I mean, you can't say that today.
Yeah, that's true.
But back then, it was definitely true. And
so did that silence the other panelists, or did discussion ensue?
No, it was pretty much silence for a minute or two. And I hate a vacuum in speech. So I start talking about how you simply cannot have crusades with no visible means of support. There is no medieval gold card. And there's only been one crusade ever taken in human history where people had no money. It's called the Children's Crusade. And they all ended up dead or enslaved.
Right.
It's true.
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah.
And then I got on to the business of, there's a noted novelist who I will not name, who has got 10,000 armed knights on a side. Well, there's a problem with that. It takes about 1,200 acres, maybe more if the land's poor, to support one armed knight. Now you multiply that by 10,000 on each side, you don't have a country you can hold together with horses.
Right.
Well, by this time, the fantasy authors are not real happy with me.
I imagine not.
And there's a certain amount of mumbling. And I overheard somebody say, damned science fiction author couldn't write a fantasy if his life depended on it. Now, the name Modesitt is either corrupt Old English or French Huguenot. We don't know which. But
Yeah.
most of my ancestry is Irish. And you do not tell the Irish they cannot do something.
This is true. So the gauntlet was thrown.
Well, I just picked up the gauntlet. Nobody exactly threw it. But I thought, I can write a science fiction, I mean, it's a fantasy novel, with workable economics, appropriate technology, and still have it be a fantasy. And so I wrote The Magic of Recluce literally as a one-off. I had no intent at that point in doing more than that. It was just a challenge. Well, David, when he got the book, I never told him I was writing him. I just said I was working on another book.
Mhm.
When he got it, he called me up and said, "What is this?" And I said, "Before you say that, just read it." And to his credit, he did. And he eventually called me back and said, "I like it. We'll publish it." Well, they
Always
published,
what we authors want to hear.
yes, they published it, and it barely earned out in hardcover. But they said, "Okay, we'll publish it in mass market." And it did quite a bit better, but it was not a bestseller. But the thing is, it's now been in print for 30 years and it's never been out of print. It's in, I think it's 25th edition in mass market before they went to ebooks.
That's awesome.
It never stopped selling.
Which is just exactly what you want, which also means they bought more.
Well, yeah, David said, "I want another one." And I'd never even thought about what I was going to write in that universe.
Now, for those of you out there who are writers, if you plan on a one-off and your editor says, "I want more in this world," you give them more in that world. But that's when you have to sit down and do some serious thinking about your world building and whether you did, as Lee said, put some good economics and politics in there that you can stretch out over 2 or 3 more books.
Well, I had an advantage simply by my background of dealing in politics, being ex-military, having an economics background. But it was interesting.
I'll bet it was. Well, that led to several other series that are rather different. You went to the Imager series. No, that was not next. It would have been Spell Song Cycle, which is musical magic.
Okay.
And that's a world transport story.
I owe a tremendous amount to, as I said in the first book, my soprano sorceress, my wife. She's an opera singer.
Ah,
and
so she was the inspiration for the Spell Song Cycle, huh?
Yes, and she provided a great deal of the content in it. The main character in that book is Anna Marshall, who is a
Your puppy's having a good time with something.
no, my puppy is abusing the other dog.
Ah, got it.
I hope Jim can cut that part out. The main character in that book is Anna Marshall, and she is an adjunct, or I should say non-tenured music soprano, and her life is not going well. And she is teaching at Iowa State in Ames, Iowa. And she wishes she were anyplace else.
And be careful what you wish for.
Exactly. She ends up in a world which is incredibly, shall we say, misogynistic, patriarchal, but music is magic.
Right.
And that's where that came from.
That's so cool. But it's very different.
Yes.
Very different. But then you also went to a whole nother thing with Korean Chronicles and the Imagers. Those are completely different worlds as well. It's one of the things that I find so fascinating is that
it's the magic system. I mean, basically the Korean Chronicles are a takeoff on the Gaian Earth concept, except there's magic involved in it. So all of the magic draws off of the life force of the planet.
Right.
And that is the basic problem within the whole culture, because basically you've got two cultures feuding, one of which likes to bleed planets dry to build great and glorious cities using that life force, and one that just wants to stay put and keep the planet going.
Right, right. So an ecological battle brewing.
Oh, it's gone on in the course of that. The story is over 4,000 years. It's a long battle.
Now there are 8 books in Korean and 12 books in Imager. Imager came after the Korean Chronicles. Well, I guess they sort of dovetailed, but now tell me about Imager, because the Terranar is very different from your other worlds, and the Imagers are a very different concept. So tell me about that a little bit.
Well, the idea there was simply that imaging happens to be a different form of magic. Basically, it's if you can think it into existence and you've got that talent, you can do it. The problem with this is it takes, shall we say, part of your life force to do it. And if you overdo it, you'll kill yourself.
Right.
But basically, untrained imagers never make it to adulthood because they don't know how much force they're using.
Right.
Therefore, there is a college of imagers, or the Collegian Imago, which trains imagers, but they're basically, to a certain degree, feared and outcasts, and they're a very small minority. So in some lands, they're slaves. In other lands, they've done a little bit better. And basically, the Imager series takes place over the unification of a continent. And the characters involved play different roles at different time periods in that unification.
Now, over the Imager portfolio, that series takes place, how many years does that take place over?
That's about 1,000 years.
Right. Whereas Korean is is 4,000.
Right.
Now, one of the things that I found super interesting was that the Imager, when you start with Rin, he's a boy, and we get to see him grow, and we get to see him go through the school, and we, the reader, get to understand how all this works. And that to me was just a fascinating unfolding of his talent. I thought you handled that brilliantly, and it was really wonderful. So just a fangirl moment there. Now, with you also had, I missed it. I think I said that I didn't talk about the ghost books. Those were 2. And that was a very interesting series too, because it really dealt with ghosts and ghostly presences in an slightly alternate universe to ours. What inspired the ghosts?
Well, I just had this fit. I guess part of my feeling was, okay, I'm going to get geeky here. The brain creates an electrical field. We know that. You can measure it. It's very faint. And my thought was, what would happen in a world where that field happened to be stronger? And if that field got disconnected from the body, that would create a ghost.
Right.
So that was sort of the conceit behind that sort of it. And because of ghosts, history would change. And actually, in the combined volume, there are 3 books in the series. The first 2 came out in combined trade paperback. And in that trade paperback, I actually put an afterword which explains some of the differences in the history of that world from our world, because it's a parallel world to ours. How certain things would have changed because of the presence of ghosts. Because deaths are created by violent knowledge. Ghosts are created by violent, knowledgeable death. Okay. I'll give you a little thing. The population is much lower in this world than it is in our world. And it all has to do with ghosts. Can you tell me why?
No. I have some ideas, but
It's pretty simple when you think about it. Prior to 1900, almost all of childbirth occurs in the home.
Right. And we lost a lot. We lost a lot of mamas and a lot of babies.
Childbearing was the leading cause until 1900 of women's deaths. Can you imagine anything more knowledgeable and violent death than in childbirth?
No,
That means there is a ghost in the house.
always. Yeah. And probably every house.
Well, but the point is, you're a woman. Would you like to move into a guy who has a ghost in his house of his previous wife?
No.
Now, ghosts, because they're an electromagnetic field, in most cases will fade over a few years, but it's going to slow down things a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you have 5 kids to care for and you're trying to look for a second wife and the first wife doesn't approve, that could get rather spectacular.
Yeah, it's going to cut down the population enormously.
Yeah. Well, with the Ghost series, that one was so fascinating to me because I'm fascinated with that concept of the electromagnetic fields and the parallel world, which science is now showing that there are, which is super cool. But I was also very interested in the magic recluse. You kept these all interspersed. So for everybody out there, all of these series kept going at various points in times, but the longest running one is the Magic Recluse. What was the latest? The latest one was Fairhaven Rising. Is that the latest one?
That's right.
And that was the 22nd book in that series. And that just came out, right? Last year?
Yes.
Yeah. So, all of these years, it's been great to have that continue and all this. Are you planning to continue that series? Is it going to ongoing?
It's still ongoing.
Okay.
Thinking about another book. I don't want to say much because I just turned in another book. So
well, I do want to get to the new series that we were talking about, but I also want to ask, you have, I think it's 15 or 16 standalone books that were not connected particularly to any of these other worlds that you created. Are any of those favorites that you'd like to talk about?
actually, one of them is, that's Quantum Shadows. That was a book that took me literally years to write on the side. It's one of those books, if you look at the reviews, readers either love it or hate it.
It's a polarizing one.
Yes, very much so. Basically, it's far, far future.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean far, far future, like millions of years.
Mm-hmm.
And what's left of humanity is on a world called heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And there are 10, call it decalivres, which is French for 10 books. But they're basically, by that, it's in the, call it the Judeo-Christian idea of people of the book.
Right.
And these 10 hegemonies control lands on this planet, but they're separated by rivers and what have you. And the planet is encircled by, shall we say, a super AI, if you want to put it this way, which watches over everything.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody does certain things, they're going to get zapped by the lances of heaven.
Ah.
There are no bridges across the rivers. There are only ferries. And there are no aircraft are permitted. The lances of heaven will take care of that.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, there's no real restriction on technology. But each of these hegemonies is based on a different religion.
Huh.
And at the beginning of the book, a character by the name of Corvin discovers that somebody is basically using power to blast black tridents into the sacred places of each of the religions. And he wants to find out why. And I don't want to say too much, except Corvin is perhaps older than anybody around, and he has got a role to play.
Interesting. That one I have not read. Now, the one I liked that was the standalone was Solar Express. I loved the premise that you start with, that you can't militarize space. And then I thought, really? And as things progress, and Dr. Wong and Captain, do you pronounce it Tavian? Captain Tavian?
Tavoyan.
As this Solar Express bears down on the solar system, they are both trying to figure out from their different perspectives how to either study, monetize, capture, and the sort of parallels you pull into our modern economy, and how we are all the different groups around the planet are like trying to develop economically. All of that comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found that one quite a fascinating read.
That book was actually an interesting one because it was one that Tom Doherty asked me to write. Basically, he wanted me to write a book that NASA could support. And there's a little blurb on the back corner, which is as far as it goes from NASA, but several NASA scientists actually reviewed the manuscript before it was complete.
Most excellent.
And I didn't miss too much. There are a couple of things that they suggested I change technically. But the scientists who read it thought that was pretty good.
Well, I would agree. So before we get to the new series, I want to ask you a little bit about your writing process. Obviously, you're extremely prolific. You are steady in terms of your output. What's your writing process? What is something that a writer starting out today could learn from your process, or that you would suggest? What's a piece of advice you would give to a writer starting out?
I don't know that one of the things I've discovered over the years is every writer is different. I don't care how much they look alike on the surface. Every writer is different, and you have to do what works for you. I mean, I'm fortunate in some ways, or you might say cursed. I happen to be a super type A personality. I don't do nothing well. That seems odd, but I mean, I am not somebody who can sit around and just say, oh, this is wonderful, give me another beer.
Right.
I have to be doing something that has meaning anytime that I'm not exhausted. So for me, writing is a way to communicate things, and it's meaningful.
Right.
One of the things that I've learned in life is nobody was ever successful at something they didn't love.
Right. Very true.
So if you want to be a writer, you better find an aspect of writing that you love, that you can put your whole soul into. If you're really young, it wouldn't hurt to study a few languages, especially today, because unfortunately, from what I've seen, they don't teach grammar very well anymore. And the other thing is, you just have to sit down and do it. I mean, there are thousands of people out there who have great ideas and who would love to have written a book, but they don't want to put in the work of writing the book.
Right.
The one thing that I think an awful lot of young people don't get is everything has grunt work in it. Yeah. And writing has a lot of grunt work in it.
And you have to be prepared to really suck at it for quite a while before you get good enough to start doing the real work.
Yeah. And I mean, part of my background, you don't even see, because no, I didn't start writing fiction until I was in my late 20s. but I'd been writing technically professionally for 10 years at that point.
Mhm.
And I'd also been writing poetry and getting clobbered with critiques for 10 years before that. That
Right.
doesn't show up.
No,
But-
but that does develop not only the writing muscle, but the thick skin, for lack of a better phrase, that you have to have when, you know, every publisher says, yeah, not for us. Now, Lee and I both started in the time before ebooks, when you had to do it, as he said, over the transom. You had to meet an editor or an agent at a con, or you had to write them letters, and that would be by mail, not email.
Right.
And you had to send pages, and you had to do that sort of thing. So, and there was a very much of a gatekeeper scenario. So you had to keep working and pushing at it and really believe in yourself.
Plus the fact that there was simply the fact that when I started writing, there were not any computers, which means you had to hand type every page. I used a lot of whiteout, but even so, I had to retype many pages.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes you get better quicker, because you were like, I really don't want to retype that. Let me think about it for a few minutes before I type it. So what's your process? What's your daily routine in terms of your writing?
It's pretty simple. Well, it's been disrupted slightly in the last couple of months because I happen to have a 5-month-old dachshund puppy. And anybody who's had dachshunds knows, one, they're very bright. Two, they are incredibly stubborn. And they do have a mind which thinks and can be very devious. So I've been a little upset from the normal routine, but basically get up, do chores, get some exercise, shower, clean up, and sit down in front of the computer. And basically, I'll take time out to run errands, maybe fix a meal. But basically, these days I've relaxed a little bit. It's maybe 9:30 or 10 in the morning until 8 to 10 at night.
Now, do you write every day?
6 days a week, sometimes
6 days.
Sometimes 6.5.
Yeah, when the story gets a hold of you, sometimes it's 6.5.
That's true, but sometimes it's when I just got to get this done.
Right, right. Well, tell us about the new stories. You've got a new series that's coming out in October of this year, which will be the third book in the series, which you just turned in, you said would be your 80th book, which is super cool. So tell us a little bit about the new series.
It's called The Grand Illusion. And what I'm doing, and it's a gamble, I'll admit it, I am writing what I would call a truly political novel in a constitutional empire where a form of magic exists. And the form of magic that exists, if you will, because science has said we can't do this, even though it's often been postulated as a science fiction-y thing, is a certain small percentage of the population has empathetic abilities to project and read emotions. A small percentage of the population are known as susceptibles. They can be controlled by empaths. And another small percentage, and we're talking a fraction of 1%, are isolates. They are impervious to emotional manipulation and cannot be read. This is a political novel set in this, and the main character starts out as a security operative for the equivalent of a senator. He's called a counselor. But this land is a constitutional empire, and it's ruled by a council of 66. And it gets interesting after that.
Well, obviously, so far it's a 3-book arc. Yep. So do we follow the same character through all 3 books, or is it a new character with each book?
No, you'll follow this character through the first 3 books. And the first 3 books are, first book is called Isolate. The second book is called Counselor. The third book is, and I have to say tentatively, because until it's printed, or at least until it's getting through copyright and editorial. The title could change, but the title for the third book is Contrarian.
So are we to presume that our main character, and what is his name?
His name is Deckard, Stephen Delos Deckard.
So Stephen is he the isolate?
Yes, he's an isolate.
So he is unable to be read.
Yep.
Which is great in a security person, because you really wouldn't want them to be able to be manipulated.
Right. And most isolates in this world are security people in some form or another.
Can an isolate tell when someone else is being manipulated?
No, only by, no more than anybody else could tell.
Right. So they don't have that ability in addition to their isolate skills. So what makes an isolate a great security guard? Obviously, you can't control them or manipulate them.
Well, also training. Basically, Deckard's a graduate of the Military Institute. He's had postgraduate security training. And he discovered as a junior lieutenant, he is volunteered to be a security aide to a counselor. And when you're a junior officer, you pretty much got to do what the boss says.
Yeah, you say yes, sir, or ma'am.
And
so then in counselor, does he become the counselor, or is he just continue to be the aide?
Well, you'll have to find that out because he's working for a counselor.
Yes.
He's paired with an empath. Most security teams consist of one isolate and one empath. Now,
Cool.
Empaths can't be manipulated either, but they can often be stunned by a more powerful empath.
It sounds like you've set up a fascinating world.
Well, it's also a constitutional empire. And I mean that because the emperor has real powers, but they're very limited.
Right.
He can veto certain things. And he gets to choose, although they can be removed under certain conditions. He gets to choose the head of the Army and the Navy.
Aha. So he can establish a power base.
But it's very limited,
Right.
and he abuses it. The council can take it, can force a replacement. He can name somebody else, but.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, I will seriously look forward to that. That is out in October of 2021, and the first one is called Isolate.
Right.
So Lee,
I was just going to say one other little odd thing. The day it's coming out is my birthday, and that's never happened before.
Oh, how fun. That's great. Well, we will be sure to have you back on for one of our hot off the press closer to the time of publication. As we're wrapping up here, is there anything else you'd like to tell our audience about your work, about the way you work? Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Not off the top of my head, I have to say.
Well, we are super glad you were here with us. Why don't you tell everybody where they can find you? Do you use social media? Do you have just your website, or? I
do not do social media. I basically have an internet database forum, and I also have my website, which is Lee Modesitt, Modesitt, Junior, JR.com.
Excellent.
And basically, it's a pretty elaborate website. You can make comments on, I basically post, shall we say, content stuff, sometimes about books, but often about politics, generally twice a week.
Well, that's certainly better than most people do on social media, so that's wonderful.
I have basically done this for almost over 15 years. And I've managed to keep it going for that length of time.
Which is excellent. Well, you can finally hear on ConTinual as well. And is there another con that you're going to be at soon? Are you going to do Balticon this year?
I haven't done Balticon since I left the East Coast.
Well, it's a shame they didn't get you this year because it's virtual.
That's true, but I hadn't thought about that. Right now, because of the disease situation and what have you, and also because of complications with my wife's work, I don't have anything scheduled right now for the rest of this year. I'd like to get back to doing cons, but right now it's a little iffy.
Well, we'll hope to see you in the next couple of years at cons again. I hope we can all get there as well. So thank you again very much for being with us. You can find us here on ConTinual. You can find Lee on here on ConTinual as well. And I'm Jeanne Adams, your host. And thank you so much for being with us, Lee. Thank you so much for being on ConTinual.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.